Humanity has just been officially classified as a galactic security threat, but not for our weapons or our wars. The Galactic Council just banned all human art after a single charcoal sketch caused a total psychological collapse in 5 different alien species. Our creativity isn't just expression, it's a cognitive weapon. Welcome back to the channel. If this is your first time here, we tell the stories the rest of the galaxy doesn't want you to hear. The ones where humanity turns out to be a lot stranger and a lot more dangerous than anyone expected. If you like stories where the thing that finally scares an ancient civilization isn't a weapon at all, hit subscribe now, because this one is going to stay with you. Let's get into it. Cultural attaché. Maren Okafor had drawn the same face for 11 years before she ever set foot off the surface of Earth, and she had never once considered it a weapon. It was her grandmother's face, sketched from memory in soft charcoal strokes on cheap newsprint paper, the same drawing she had made, in one form or another, at least once a month since she was 19 years old, and her grandmother had died in a hospital bed in Lagos with the window open, and the evening call to prayer drifting faintly through it. It was not a particularly technical drawing. Maren had never studied fine art formally. She had studied economics, then diplomacy. Then, almost by accident, she had ended up as the junior cultural liaison assigned to humanity's first full diplomatic mission to the Threshold Assembly, a posting she had accepted mostly because nobody else in the department wanted to spend 2 years living inside a space station, orbiting a star that wasn't the sun. She had brought the sketch with her without thinking much about it at all. It fit in the inside pocket of her formal diplomatic jacket, folded twice. A small private thing she carried the way some people carried a photograph of someone they missed. She had not intended to show it to anyone. The Cassivar Cultural Summit had been scheduled for 11 months. A formal gathering of 5 member species of the Threshold Assembly, convened for the specific purpose of exchanging art, literature, music, and philosophy, in the spirit of what the summit's official charter called mutual aesthetic enrichment, a phrase that had made Maren laugh out loud the first time she read it, because it sounded, to her ear, exactly like the kind of thing a committee invents when it has never actually needed art for anything, and assumes, therefore, that art must be a simple, harmless thing to share. The 5 species in attendance had each prepared extensive, carefully curated presentations. The Ilkaresh brought a 7-hour symphonic composition built from the harmonic resonance patterns of their homeworld's tectonic activity, a piece their delegation described, through translation, as a meditation on the patience of geological time. The Nomarai brought a sculptural garden grown from living crystal, tended over 4 centuries, each facet cut to catch starlight in a different configuration, depending on the position of their home system's twin suns. The Drasa Combine brought an elaborate scent-based storytelling tradition, entire narratives conveyed through sequences of engineered aromas released in precise timed intervals. The Osaic Dominion, somewhat reluctantly, brought a series of ceremonial trade ledgers rendered in gold leaf, objects that were, by their own admission, more valuable as historical trade records than as art in any sense the other delegations recognized, but which the Osaic considered their species' highest cultural achievement regardless. And the Vorathi, whose martial culture rarely produced anything the rest of the assembly considered artistic in a conventional sense, brought a series of ceremonial war recitations, rhythmic spoken performances describing famous battles in language so precisely metered that translation software struggled to render its cadence into any other tongue. Humanity's delegation, small and still finding its footing 18 months after first contact, had been asked to contribute something modest. A song, perhaps, a short piece of literature, something, the summit's organizers had suggested gently, that would not take up too much of the schedule, given that humanity's cultural contribution was, as far as the Assembly's own cultural anthropologists could determine from 6 years of remote observation, likely to be, in the polite language of the official summit brief, aesthetically unremarkable by galactic standards. Maren had been asked, almost as an afterthought, to give a brief opening remark before the human delegation's official contribution, a folk song selected by committee back on Earth, was performed. She had agreed. She had not planned to bring the sketch out at all. But standing at the podium, 11 months into a posting that had, if she was honest with herself, been quietly, steadily lonely in a way she had not expected and had not told anyone back home about. She found herself talking not about the folk song, or the summit's charter, or the careful diplomatic language she had rehearsed for weeks, but about her grandmother and the hospital window, and the sound of the evening call to prayer drifting in over machines that had, by that point, mostly stopped being useful. And somewhere in the middle of that unplanned, unrehearsed digression, she reached into her jacket, and without entirely deciding to, held up the folded sketch for the room to see. The first sign that something had gone deeply wrong was the silence. Not the ordinary silence of an audience listening politely to a speaker they did not fully understand. The kind of silence Marin had grown used to over 18 months of addressing rooms full of species whose translation software rendered her words a half-second behind her mouth. This was a different silence entirely, total and immediate. The specific silence of a room in which every single non-human occupant had, in the space of perhaps 4 seconds, simultaneously stopped moving. The Ilkaresh delegation's antennae, which never fully stilled even in sleep according to every physiological briefing Marin had studied before her posting, went rigid and motionless. The Nomarai representative, a being whose crystalline external structure shifted color constantly in response to ambient emotional cues, went a shade of gray-white that the summit's own medical staff would later describe in the incident report as a coloration never previously observed in a living member of the species. The Drasa Combine's senior trade delegate, seated in the second row, simply folded forward at the waist and did not move again under his own power. The Osaic representative's slitted yellow eyes rolled back, unfocused, still open. And the single Vorathi observer present, a species Marin had been warned repeatedly never to underestimate for its combat discipline and near-total emotional composure, made a sound that the incident report would later transcribe only as a low, involuntary vocalization. The kind, medical staff noted, that Vorathi physiology was not believed capable of producing outside of extreme trauma. Marin stood at the podium for nearly 11 full seconds, the sketch still held up in one hand, entirely unaware that anything unusual had happened at all, before the first human aide reached her side and gently, urgently, told her to put it away. By the time medical teams from all 5 delegations arrived, 23 non-human attendees across the summit floor were in what the eventual joint medical report would classify as an acute catatonic, dissociative state, unresponsive to external stimuli, vital signs stable but drastically slowed, a condition none of the attending physicians drawn from 5 different medical traditions representing collectively over 11,000 years of accumulated xenomedical knowledge had ever encountered before in any species. Under any circumstances, it would take the Assembly's medical establishment 9 full days to determine, with any confidence, what had actually happened. It would take the Ninth Council considerably longer to decide what to do about it. Dr. Sanaya Trell, senior xenopsychologist for the Ilkaresh Cultural Institute, and the physician who would eventually lead the joint investigation into what became known, in official assembly records, as the Kasivar incident, had built her 400-year career on a single foundational principle of galactic psychology, one taught in every assembly medical academy since the founding of the Threshold Assembly itself. Intelligent minds, regardless of species, process emotional and aesthetic information through structures that, while varying enormously in biological architecture, share a common underlying logic, a logic built ultimately on pattern recognition and predictive modeling. A being experiences sorrow or joy or awe because its mind has recognized a pattern, categorized it against prior experience, and generated an appropriate emotional response calibrated to that pattern's significance. This was, Dr. Trell had taught for over 3 centuries, simply how minds worked. Across every one of the Assembly's dozens of member and observer species, a universal architecture of feeling that made cross-species empathy, translation, and cultural exchange possible at all. The charcoal sketch of Marin Okafor's grandmother did not fit this architecture. I want to be precise about what I'm about to say, because I understand how it will sound. Dr. Trell told the Emergency Medical Tribunal convened 6 days after the incident, standing before a projection of the sketch itself, reproduced at full scale, the same soft, imprecise lines Marin had drawn from memory 100 times before. Every other art form represented at that summit operated on a recognizable emotional logic. The Ilkaresh symphony built tension through harmonic patterns any trained mind could anticipate and resolve. The Nomarai crystal garden generated aesthetic pleasure through predictable, mathematically elegant light refraction. Even the Vorathi war recitations, alien as their cadence is to non-Vorathi ears, follow a rhetorical structure our translation matrices can model and our minds can process, tension building toward a resolution the listening mind can anticipate. She gestured toward the projected sketch. This does not do that. This image contains no resolution. It depicts a face that is, by every objective visual metric our analysis software can measure, imprecise, asymmetrical, technically unrefined. It offers no narrative structure, no build and release, no pattern for a receiving mind to anticipate and resolve. And yet, when presented to minds built to expect exactly that kind of resolvable pattern in any communicative aesthetic act, it appears to have triggered something closer to a total failure of predictive processing itself. 23 separate minds from 4 different species encountered a piece of communication their own cognitive architecture could not resolve into any recognizable emotional category, and the failure to resolve it did not simply produce confusion, it produced collapse. You are describing an aesthetic experience that breaks minds simply by existing, said Counselor Itten, the Nomarai administrator, whose own species had suffered 3 catatonic casualties in the incident, his usually measured voice carrying an edge. Marin, watching the tribunal's proceedings from the gallery, had not heard from him before. You are telling this tribunal that a single drawing, made by an untrained artist, using no technology, no weaponized frequency, nothing but pigment and paper, incapacitated more of my people in 4 seconds than an entire Vorathi assault fleet has managed in a decade of open conflict. I am telling you, Dr. Trell said, that I do not yet fully understand what happened, and neither does anyone else on this tribunal. But I can tell you what the preliminary data suggests, and I want every representative in this chamber to sit with how uncomfortable that suggestion is before we proceed any further. She let the silence stretch for a long moment before continuing. I believe the image encodes something our species, and perhaps every species in this assembly except the humans themselves, has no prior cognitive category for it all. Not sorrow in the sense any of us understand sorrow, as a pattern with an eventual resolution, however distant. Something closer to an acknowledgement, rendered in imprecise, deliberately unresolved lines, of loss that simply does not resolve, that was never going to resolve, that the human mind appears to have evolved to hold without requiring resolution at all. Every mind in that room except the human minds present attempted, automatically, instinctively, to process that image the way we process every aesthetic communication, by searching for the pattern's eventual release. There was no release to find, and I believe, though I cannot yet prove it with the rigor this tribunal deserves, that the search itself, conducted at a speed and depth none of us consciously control, is what caused the collapse. Quick pause here because I think you deserve to sit with that for a second the same way the tribunal had to. An untrained sketch of somebody's grandmother, and it's being treated like a weapons-grade incident by a species that's had crystal gardens and tectonic symphonies for longer than humans have had written language. If you want to know how the council actually voted on this, stick around, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good time, because what happens in the next part of this hearing is the part nobody expected. Drop a comment telling me if you think this ban is going to hold. Back to the story. The Emergency Medical Tribunal's findings reached the 9th Council 11 days after the Kasivar incident, accompanied by a formal recommendation that Marin Okafor read twice before she fully understood what it was actually proposing, because the language, careful and clinical as it was, described something that felt, to her, less like a medical finding and more like an indictment of everything she had ever loved about being human. The investigating tribunal recommends the 9th Council classify human representational and expressive art, in all documented forms, including but not limited to visual, literary, and musical media, as a grade S psychological hazard to non-human cognitive stability, pending further study. This classification reflects not an assessment of malicious intent on the part of the human species, for which the tribunal finds no evidence whatsoever, but rather an objective determination that certain categories of human aesthetic expression appear capable of inducing acute, potentially permanent cognitive collapse in non-human minds through mechanisms not yet fully understood, and for which no current assembly medical protocol offers reliable protection or treatment. The Ninth Council convened an emergency session 4 days later, and Marin, invited to attend as a representative of the human delegation, despite the fact that she was, by any reasonable measure, the direct cause of the entire crisis, sat through 6 hours of debate that ranged from clinical to openly fearful. Watching representatives of species who had, until 11 days earlier, considered humanity a promising but fundamentally minor curiosity in galactic affairs, begin to speak about her species in the careful, wary language usually reserved for the Assembly's most dangerous and unpredictable threats. We have spent the last year adjusting to the fact that this species cannot be conquered militarily, said the representative of the Drasa Combine, whose own senior trade delegate remained in a medical facility, unresponsive, 11 days after the incident, his condition unchanged despite the best efforts of 5 different species medical traditions working in concert. I did not expect to spend this council session adjusting to the fact that we may not be able to safely look at their paintings either. That is an exaggeration, and you know it, said Theskvan, the Ilkaresh diplomat whose warnings about humanity had, over the preceding year, gone from dismissed to grudgingly respected, to in recent months, treated with something approaching genuine deference. A single specific image produced under highly specific emotional circumstances by an artist working from deeply personal, unrehearsed grief, produced this reaction. We do not yet know whether this is a universal property of all human art, or a rare and specific circumstance produced by a particular convergence of subject matter, emotional authenticity, and delivery that may not easily repeat. Can you guarantee that? The Drasa representative asked. Can you guarantee, diplomat, that the next human artist who stands before a room full of assembly delegates, moved by grief or love or whatever this species calls the emotion that produced that image, will not produce the exact same effect again? Because I do not believe you can, and I do not believe this council can afford to gamble 23 more minds, or 230, on the answer. It was into this exchange that Dr. Trell, granted speaking privileges as the tribunal's lead investigator, offered the finding that would ultimately tip the council's vote, a finding she delivered with the same careful, measured precision she had used throughout the entire investigation, and which Marin would later describe in her own private notes on the affair, as the moment she understood that humanity's own art might genuinely be more dangerous to the rest of the galaxy than its warships had ever been. I conducted over the last 4 days a supplementary study, Dr. Trell said, using a controlled sample of additional human artistic works provided voluntarily by the human delegation and reviewed under strict medical safety protocols, exposure limited to single still images viewed for no more than 2 seconds by volunteer subjects wearing full neural monitoring equipment, with an immediate cognitive extraction protocol on standby in case of adverse reaction. She paused, and Marin, watching from the gallery, felt something cold settle in her stomach at the careful, clinical weight of what was clearly about to come next. 7 of the 12 images tested produced measurable, though considerably milder versions of the same cognitive disruption observed at Cassivar. Not catatonic collapse in these controlled brief exposures, but clear, significant, and in several cases quite severe emotional destabilization in non-human test subjects, ranging from what our Ilkaresh volunteer described as an unbearable and inexplicable grief with no identifiable cause, to what our Nomarai volunteer described as a total, if temporary, collapse of her species' normally rigid emotional coloration response, to what our single Vorathi volunteer, a species whose combat discipline is specifically trained to suppress exactly this kind of destabilizing response, described, and I quote directly from the debrief as, quote, "the closest thing to fear I have felt since I was a hatchling," end quote, produced entirely by a still image of an empty chair beside a window. She let that land before continuing. I do not believe this is a rare or isolated property of one grieving artist's single unrehearsed sketch. I believe, based on this supplementary data, that a meaningful percentage of human artistic expression, produced across an enormous range of styles, subjects, and skill levels over the entirety of this species' relatively brief recorded history, contains some structural or conceptual element. Our own species' cognitive architecture is simply not equipped to safely process. I do not know what that element is. I suspect, and I want to be clear that this is a hypothesis rather than a confirmed finding, that it relates to the human capacity to hold unresolved sorrow, unresolved loss. Without requiring the kind of narrative or emotional resolution, every other species in this assembly's cognitive architecture appears to demand as a precondition for safely processing difficult emotional material at all. What are you suggesting we do with that information, Doctor? Counselor Etten asked, and for the first time in the entire proceeding, Marin heard something in his voice that sounded, unmistakably, like genuine fear. I am suggesting, Dr. Trell said, that until this assembly's medical establishment develops a far better understanding of exactly what makes human aesthetic expression so uniquely difficult for the rest of us to safely process, the tribunal's original recommendation stands. Classify it. Restrict it. Not because this species intends harm, I want to be unambiguous about that, but because we have just discovered, in the most painful way possible, that this species has been quietly, unknowingly capable of inflicting a kind of psychological damage on the rest of us that none of our own art forms, across 11,000 years of galactic culture, have ever been capable of producing in return. The vote, when it finally came, was not close. 8 votes in favor of the Grade S classification, 1 abstention, cast by Thesk Van, who stated for the record that she did not believe the tribunal's data, yet supported a permanent sweeping restriction, though she did not have sufficient evidence to argue against an immediate precautionary one either. The formal decree reached Earth's diplomatic mission 3 days later, delivered in the same flat, procedural language the Assembly reserved for its most consequential rulings, regardless of how strange or unprecedented the underlying reality actually was. Notice of cultural classification. Human representational and expressive artistic works in all documented visual, literary, and musical forms are hereby classified as a Grade S psychological hazard under Assembly Cultural Safety Protocol. Effective immediately, the export, public display, or unmediated presentation of such works to non-human individuals is prohibited pending further study by the Joint Xenopsychological Review Board. This classification does not reflect any determination of malicious intent, and the Assembly wishes to emphasize its continued goodwill toward the human species. However, the safety of Assembly member populations must take precedence pending a fuller understanding of the mechanisms involved. Ambassador Daniel Osgood, the same weary, patient diplomat who had, 18 months earlier, absorbed the news of humanity's reclassification as a medically indefinite lifespan species with cautious optimism, read this new decree with an expression Marin would later describe, in a message home to her mother, as the look of a man who has simply run out of new ways to be surprised by his own species. "They're not banning our weapons," Osgood said, when Marin came to his office to discuss the decree's implications for her own position within the delegation. "They're banning our feelings, or the way we put them on paper, at least." "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," Marin said, and she meant it, the words catching slightly in her throat, because in the 11 days since Cassivar, she had not stopped replaying that moment at the podium, the folded sketch in her hand, the 11 seconds of silence before anyone told her something had gone wrong. "I know you didn't," Osgood said. "I don't think anyone on that tribunal believes you did either. That's what makes this so strange. You didn't attack anyone, Marin. You grieved in front of a room full of people who had never seen anyone grieve like that before, and it turns out that grieving, for us apparently, might be one of the most dangerous things in the galaxy." News of the classification did not stay confined to diplomatic channels for long. Within days, Assembly media networks, which had spent the better part of 2 years covering humanity primarily as a military curiosity, a species that had somehow fought 2 Assembly fleets to a standstill through stubbornness and improvisation, pivoted almost overnight to a very different kind of coverage. one that treated the Cassivar incident less like a medical footnote and more like the discovery of an entirely new category of danger the galaxy had never had to consider before. The framing varied wildly depending on the network and the species producing it. Osaic trade broadcasts, ever pragmatic, focused almost entirely on the economic implications, extensive analysis of what a permanent restriction on human cultural export might mean for the handful of assembly citizens who had already begun collecting human art as a novelty status symbol in the 18 months since first contact. Vorathi military channels ran a starkly different narrative, several commentators openly speculating, with a seriousness that alarmed Ambassador Osgood considerably more than any of the Cassivar incident's actual findings, about whether human artistic expression could someday be weaponized deliberately, refined and deployed the way a chemical agent might be, against enemy populations rather than encountered by accident at a cultural summit. Dr. Trell's own Ilkaresh Cultural Institute issued a public statement, unusually restrained given its species' reputation for florid diplomatic language, urging calm and reminding the wider assembly public that the tribunal had found, and continued to find, absolutely no evidence of malicious intent behind the incident. It was the Vorathi speculation that worried Marin most, not because she believed it was likely, but because she understood, in a way she suspected few non-humans fully grasped, exactly how insulting the premise was to everything the sketch had actually meant to her. She had drawn her grandmother's face because she missed her, not because she had ever imagined, even for a moment, that grief could be aimed at anyone. "They think it's a gun," she told Osgood, during one of the increasingly frequent evenings the two of them spent together in his office, going over yet another round of assembly commentary translated and forwarded by the mission's small press liaison staff. "They can't imagine it being anything else. A species that measures its own art by how precisely it can describe a battle looks at a drawing of my grandmother, and the only category they have for it is weapon." "Give them time," Osgood said, though even he did not sound especially convinced. "It took them the better part of a year to stop thinking of us purely as a military problem after the war. I imagine it'll take at least that long before they stop thinking of Cassivar the same way." A junior Vorathi military attaché stationed at the Assembly's central diplomatic complex, a young officer named Dras Kellen, who had, unlike most of his species, developed a quiet, personal fascination with human culture in the months since first contact, requested through official channels formal permission to undergo a supervised exposure test himself, arguing that if any species in the Assembly needed to understand precisely what it might be facing, both as a potential threat and as a potential resource, it was the one whose entire culture was built around disciplined emotional control in the face of danger. His request was granted reluctantly, by a tribunal still deeply divided over whether any further voluntary exposure should be permitted at all, while the investigation remained ongoing. Dr. Trell personally oversaw the session, conducted 4 weeks before Vesa Nari's unauthorized viewing would upend the Assembly's entire understanding of the phenomenon, and the image selected for the test, chosen specifically for being considerably milder than the sketch that had caused the original incident, was a photograph, not even a painting, of an elderly human soldier's empty boots left beside a memorial wall, a piece the museum archive had catalogued simply as Untitled, Remembrance Day, submitted by an anonymous veteran decades earlier. Kellen's reaction, recorded under full medical monitoring, did not produce catatonic collapse, but it produced something that unsettled Dr. Trell's observation team almost as deeply in its own way. The young officer, whose species had spent 11,000 years training its warriors to feel grief for the fallen, only within tightly ritualized, communally shared mourning ceremonies designed explicitly to prevent exactly the kind of prolonged, unresolved private sorrow the image seemed to depict, sat in absolute silence for nearly 20 minutes after the image was removed from his view. And when he finally spoke, it was not to report distress at all. "I do not know what to do with this feeling," he told Dr. Trell, according to the session transcript later included as an appendix to the tribunal's supplementary report. "My people have rituals for grief. We are never alone in it, not once. Not for a single moment. From the instant a warrior falls until the mourning period is formally closed by the entire unit together. This image describes grief that no one is sharing. No unit. No ritual. Simply one pair of boots. And whoever is not standing in them anymore. And no ceremony coming to close it. I find that I cannot stop thinking about it, and I do not know whether that is because it has damaged something in me, or because it has shown me something my own culture has never once allowed me to feel for myself, alone, without the entire unit standing beside me to help me put it down again afterward. Dr. Trell would cite Kellen's testimony repeatedly in the months that followed, long before Vecinari's far more dramatic account arrived, as the first genuine hint that the tribunal's original, purely defensive framing of the Cassivar incident might be missing something essential about what had actually happened in that summit hall. The weeks that followed the decree's arrival were, for humanity's small diplomatic presence within the Threshold Assembly, some of the strangest and most disorienting of the entire first contact period. Stranger in their own quiet way, Marin would later reflect, than either of the two military engagements humanity had already fought and survived. There was no fleet to rally against a psychological classification, no interceptor to build, no shield to reinforce, no clear enemy to out-innovate. There was only a growing, uncomfortable awareness spreading slowly through assembly society that the species everyone had spent the last year and a half learning to fear militarily might also, quietly, be capable of inflicting a very different kind of harm, one that no assembly weapon had ever produced and no assembly medicine yet knew how to treat. Human museums back on Earth found themselves fielding an unprecedented flood of formal diplomatic inquiries from assembly cultural institutes, requests not for access but for information, careful clinical questions about the specific techniques, subjects, and emotional content of individual pieces, submitted by researchers who wanted, more than anything, to understand what exactly they had been so unprepared to survive. Dr. Trell's Joint Xenopsychological Review Board, granted expanded authority and an enormous new research budget in the wake of the Cassivar incident, spent the following 4 months conducting an increasingly careful, increasingly rigorous study of human artistic expression, working exclusively with volunteer human artists back on Earth and volunteer non-human test subjects drawn from 6 different assembly member species, all conducted under strict medical safety protocols that grew more elaborate with every new session. The findings, when they finally emerged in a report that ran to over 6,000 pages, did not simplify the picture. If anything, they deepened it. Not all human art produced the destabilizing effect. Landscape paintings, still lifes, abstract geometric compositions, the overwhelming majority of visual art humanity had produced across its recorded history, tested entirely safe for non-human viewing, producing responses ranging from mild aesthetic pleasure to genuine confusion, but nothing resembling the Cassivar reaction. Music without lyrics tested almost universally safe, regardless of emotional tone. Purely narrative literature, describing events without dwelling extensively on unresolved internal grief, tested safe as well, even when the events described were themselves tragic. The dangerous category, when Dr. Trell's team finally isolated it with any precision, was narrower and stranger than anyone had initially feared, but also, in its own way, more unsettling, because it revealed something about human psychology that even human researchers working alongside the Assembly's investigators found themselves struggling to fully articulate even in their own language. "It's not sadness," Dr. Trell explained, in a briefing delivered to the reconvened Ninth Council 4 months after the initial incident, and it took my team considerable time to understand why our early hypothesis, that human depictions of sorrow were simply too intense for non-human minds to process, was not quite correct. Human artists produce sorrowful work constantly, prolifically, across every medium, and the overwhelming majority of it tests entirely safe for non-human exposure. What we have identified, instead, is a much narrower category of work, produced almost always without conscious technical intention, in which a human artist manages to render a specific psychological state their own species appears to describe using several distinct but related terms that do not translate cleanly into any assembly language. Among them, we are told, the words bittersweet and hirieth, and the phrase they have offered us as perhaps the closest single equivalent, the ache of loving something you have already, in some sense, lost. She allowed the silence to settle before continuing. This specific psychological state, when rendered successfully in art, and I want to emphasize that human artists themselves report being unable to reliably produce it on command, describing it instead as something that happens, in their words, when the work is honest enough, appears to encode an acceptance of unresolved loss that simply does not require, and does not offer, any narrative resolution at all. Every other species in this assembly's cognitive architecture, so far as our research has been able to determine, processes loss as a problem to be resolved, a wound to be healed, a pattern to be completed. Humans, it appears, evolved the capacity to hold loss as a permanent, unresolved, and yet somehow bearable feature of ongoing experience, without requiring resolution, without requiring healing, simply carrying it forward alongside everything else. And when they succeed in rendering that specific acceptance visible, in a drawing, in a piece of music, in a poem, minds built to expect resolution encounter something they have no framework for surviving intact. Is there a way to identify this category of work in advance? Counselor Itun asked. Before it is displayed, before anyone is exposed? Not reliably, no, Dr. Trell admitted. The human artists we interviewed could not identify it reliably in their own work in advance either. Ambassador Okafor herself did not know, before that summit, that the sketch she carried was capable of producing this effect. She had drawn variations of the same image many times over many years for herself, never intending it as a performance for anyone at all. It was, by every account we have gathered, simply honest, in a way that even she could not have predicted or controlled. One more quick break here because I think this is the part of the story that really gets under your skin once you sit with it. It's not that human art is too sad. It's that we've apparently evolved to survive carrying grief that never resolves, and nobody else out there knows how to do that safely, not even by accident. If that gives you chills the way it gave me chills writing it, let me know in the comments. And if you're not subscribed yet, this is exactly the kind of channel that's going to keep finding stories like this one. Okay, let's finish this. The Grade S classification remained in effect for 11 months following the Kasivar incident, a period during which human artistic export to the wider assembly remained formally prohibited, though, as Maren Okafor would later note in a memoir she published years afterward, informal and unofficial interest in human art, among individual assembly citizens curious enough to seek it out through less regulated channels, grew steadily and quietly throughout the entire period of the ban, a fact the Assembly's own cultural institutes were slow to acknowledge and slower still to address. It was, in the end, not a council vote that ended the formal restriction, but a single quiet, unauthorized act committed by an aging Nomarai crystal sculptor named Ves Anari, a citizen with no diplomatic standing and no official role in any of the proceedings that had, over the preceding 11 months, determined her species' formal relationship with human creativity. Ves Anari had lost her life-bonded partner of 180 years to a mining accident on one of the Nomarai homeworld's outer colonies 4 years before the Kasivar incident, and had spent much of the intervening time, according to her own later account, quietly unable to render the specific quality of her own grief into any of the crystal-growing techniques her species' art form traditionally offered. Techniques built, like every other art form the Assembly's older species had developed around eventual resolution, eventual light, eventual completion. She had, in the 11 months since the ban, obtained, through channels she never fully disclosed to Assembly investigators, a small collection of reproductions of human visual art, smuggled through the same informal, unregulated interest that had been quietly growing across Assembly space despite the formal prohibition. Among them was a print of a painting by a 20th-century human artist named Edward Hopper, depicting a single figure seated alone at a window in fading evening light, a work that had, in its own era on Earth, been described by human critics using words very similar to the ones Dr. Trell's research team had eventually settled on: bittersweet, unresolved, quietly, permanently sad in a way that asked for no fixing at all. Ves Anari viewed the print alone in her own home, without medical supervision, without safety protocols, in direct and deliberate violation of the Assembly's decree. She reported afterward, to the same joint xenopsychological review board that had spent nearly a year studying the phenomenon from a careful, clinical distance, that she had experienced something she could only describe, in her own species' language, as a grief so total and so immediate that she had for several minutes genuinely believed she might be dying. And then she reported something had shifted, quietly without warning, into something she had no prior word for at all. Something that felt, she told the tribunal in testimony that would later be widely quoted across assembly cultural discourse, like being permitted for the first time since her partner's death to simply carry the loss rather than search endlessly for a way to resolve it. "I do not believe this art form is dangerous," Vesa Nahri told the tribunal, an elderly Nomarai citizen with no diplomatic authority whatsoever, addressing a body that had spent nearly a year treating her species' safety as a matter requiring the highest level of formal protection. "I believe it is simply honest in a way our own art has never learned to be, because our own art has never needed to learn how to survive loss that does not resolve. I have carried my grief for 4 years the way our culture has taught me to carry it, waiting for the day it would finally complete itself into something bearable. It never has. This human painting did not complete it either, but it did something I did not think possible. It sat beside me in it, without asking me to finish it first." Dr. Trell's team spent the following 3 months conducting a far more careful, far more voluntary study, working this time not with brief clinical exposures under strict monitoring, but with willing, informed non-human participants who understood, going in, exactly what they were choosing to experience and who were given, for the first time, the option to sit with the resulting emotional response for as long as they needed, rather than undergoing immediate cognitive extraction at the first sign of distress. The results, when they finally reached the Ninth Council in a supplementary report, 8 months after Vesa Nahri's testimony, painted a considerably more complicated picture than the original Kasivar incident had suggested. The dangerous category of human art remained genuinely dangerous, Dr. Trell's team confirmed, when experienced suddenly, without warning, without preparation, by minds that had no framework at all for what they were about to encounter. But that same category, experienced deliberately, with informed consent, by minds given the time and support to sit with an unfamiliar and destabilizing emotional experience, rather than being forcibly, immediately extracted from it, produced something the original tribunal's clinical, safety-focused methodology had never been designed to detect at all, something that looked unmistakably like healing. Not the kind of healing every other species in the assembly had spent millennia building their own art forms to produce: resolution, completion, the closing of a wound. Something else entirely, a capacity, apparently transferable across species with the right preparation and support, to simply carry an unresolved loss, without collapsing under the weight of searching endlessly for a resolution that would never actually come. "I do not believe we were wrong 11 months ago to be afraid," Dr. Trell told the council. In the final report that would ultimately overturn the Grade S classification and replace it with something far more nuanced, a supervised cultural exchange protocol that remained in careful, gradual use for years afterward. The Kasivar incident was real, the harm was real, and 23 people suffered genuine, serious psychological trauma that this assembly was entirely correct to take with the utmost seriousness. But I believe we were wrong about what that harm meant. We assumed, because it was unfamiliar and because it broke our own cognitive expectations so completely, that it could only ever be dangerous. We did not consider, until Vesa Nahri's testimony forced us to reconsider, that the same unfamiliarity that made it so destabilizing when encountered without warning might also be exactly what made it valuable when encountered with care. Marin Okafor returned to Earth for the first time in nearly 3 years the same month the Grade S classification was formally lifted, replaced by the new supervised exchange protocol that would, over the following decade, slowly transform human art into one of the most sought-after, carefully regulated, and deeply valued cultural exports the young human diplomatic presence had to offer the wider galaxy. She still carried the sketch of her grandmother in the inside pocket of her jacket, folded twice, the same small private thing it had always been before an entire room full of strangers taught her, in the worst possible way, exactly how much weight it was quietly capable of carrying. She showed it, before she left the station for the last time, to Dr. Trell, in a private meeting neither of their governments had officially sanctioned or recorded, both of them fully aware of what the image was now capable of doing, and both of them this time prepared for it. Dr. Trell sat with it for a long time afterward, her usually composed 400-year-old face carrying an expression Marin had never seen on any Ilkaresh face before. Something that was not quite the collapse Cassivar had produced, and not quite the ordinary aesthetic appreciation her species usually offered human work, but something new, something that looked, more than anything, like the quiet, unhurried process of learning to carry a weight without needing to put it down. "I understand now," Dr. Trell said finally, "why your species survived becoming what you have become. Every other people this assembly has ever met needed their grief to end before they could move forward. You simply learned to move forward carrying it. I do not know if that makes you the strangest species this galaxy has ever discovered, or the wisest one. I suspect, having spent the last 2 years studying you, that it may simply make you both at once." "I never meant for it to be a weapon," Marin said quietly. "No," Dr. Trell agreed. "I do not believe you did. I believe, Ambassador Okafor, that you simply meant for it to be true. It seems that for your species, those two things have never been very far apart. Back on Earth, the years of the Great S restriction and its eventual gradual lifting had produced a strange, quiet ripple effect through human culture itself, one that most people outside the small diplomatic and scientific circles involved in the affair barely noticed at the time, but which historians would later point to as one of the first moments humanity began to understand itself differently in light of what the wider galaxy had discovered about it. Art schools across a dozen countries began receiving unusual, informal inquiries from human researchers working alongside the Assembly's Joint Xenopsychological Review Board, questions about technique, about intention, about whether an artist could ever say in advance whether a piece was likely to carry that specific unnameable quality. Dr. Trell's team had spent months trying to define in language borrowed haphazardly from a dozen human tongues. The artists themselves, when asked, mostly shrugged, the way artists on Earth had always shrugged at questions about where exactly a piece of honest work actually came from. Some pointed to Hopper. Some pointed to old blues records, work songs sung by people who had every reason in the world to want resolution, and had, instead, simply learned to sing the ache without needing it to end. Some pointed to grandmothers, to old photographs, to the particular quality of light in a hallway nobody lived in anymore. None of them, Marin noted in her own report back to the diplomatic office overseeing the affair, described what they did as choosing to make something dangerous. They described it, almost universally, as trying to make something true, and being willing, in the trying, to leave the wound open on the page rather than sew it closed for the comfort of whoever might look at it afterward. It was Ambassador Osgood, in the end, who put it most plainly, in a private cable to the diplomatic office back on Earth. Written the same week the Grade S classification was formally lifted and replaced with the new Supervised Exchange Protocol, a document that would later be quoted in edited form, in more than one history of humanity's first contact era. "We have spent 2 years teaching this assembly that we cannot be conquered," Osgood wrote. "I am beginning to suspect that lesson was, in some sense, the easy one. This second lesson, that we cannot fully be understood either, not without real risk to the ones doing the understanding, feels like it may end up mattering more in the long run. They came expecting to catalog us as one more variable in a very old equation. I do not think they expected to discover that some part of what makes us worth cataloging at all is a capacity to sit inside our own grief, without needing it to end. A capacity none of them, for all their crystal gardens and tectonic symphonies and 11,000 years of accumulated culture, ever had reason to develop for themselves. I do not know whether that makes us more valuable to this assembly, or more unsettling to it. I suspect, having watched this whole strange affair unfold from the inside, that for a species like this one those two things may never be very far apart either. If this is the first time you've heard how close an entire diplomatic relationship came to collapsing over a single charcoal sketch of somebody's grandmother, you're not alone. And neither was the Ninth Council, sitting in that chamber trying to decide whether humanity's grief was a threat to be contained or a gift nobody else in the galaxy had ever learned to give. Somewhere in the years that followed, Long after the grade S classification had faded into the kind of footnote historians argue about rather than diplomats fear, Marin Okafor would be asked more than once at conferences and retrospectives and the occasional nervous student's thesis defense whether she regretted holding up that sketch at all. She always gave the same answer, in one form or another, and it never seemed to fully satisfy the people asking. Though it satisfied her, she did not regret it. She had not meant to teach an entire assembly of ancient, accomplished civilizations something about grief that none of their own 11,000 years of culture had prepared them to learn. She had simply meant to remember her grandmother out loud, in a room of strangers, on a day when the missing had gotten too large to carry silently, that the rest of the galaxy had needed eventually to learn how to sit beside that kind of missing without demanding it resolve into something smaller was not, she came to believe, a flaw in what she had done. It was simply the oldest and most human thing about the whole affair, that something private, something never meant as an offering to anyone, turned out to be exactly the thing an entire universe of strangers needed most, whether they were ready for it or not. Thank you so much for staying with me through this whole story. This one took a strange, quiet turn I honestly wasn't expecting when I started writing it, and I hope it stayed with you the way it stayed with me. If this one hit you differently than our usual stories, let me know in the comments. I always read every single one. If you're new here, welcome, and if you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss whatever we find next time. Until then, take care of each other, stay curious, and stay human.